Chapter 6. Vogel. As Shadrach Vogel strode past the long brick flower bed at the library's entrance, the beautiful array of flowers wilted. The edges of the green leaves curled and browned. A 5-year-old girl and her mother passed him on their way out. The mother eyed Vogel with growing unease as he passed. He was only 60, but he looked much older. Lack of sleep had added dark circles to his cold eyes. The floppy black hat, scruffy beard, and simple overalls gave him an Amish appearance, as he hoped it would. Vogel had grown tired of people asking why he rode in a horse and buggy. The disguise put a stop to all of that, allowing them to deposit him in a comfortably familiar category. He scowled as he passed the mother and child. The girl wrinkled her nose at his foul odor, but quickly forgot it when she spotted Vogel's horse and buggy. "Ooh, a horse!" the girl said with excitement. "Can we pet her?" "Maybe another time," her mother said, and pulled her daughter closer. The library was small, but it was the only one in town, and Vogel needed information. The books were of no interest to him. It was a computer that he needed. Once inside the library, he scanned the large room and spotted a row of computers in cubicles along the back wall. As he made his way over, the fluorescent lights above him flickered. Vogel snatched 2 pencils from a table as he passed. He pulled out a chair and sat at the only available spot. The people at the computers on either side of him wrinkled their noses in unison and covered their mouths. The full weight of Vogel's odor caught up with him, and they quickly retreated. He didn't have the usual sweat and urine odor of a homeless man. It was more like the putrid smell of death, made worse by the accumulation of white pigeon droppings on his shoulders and hat. "Time to find out what brought me here," he thought, and tapped the keyboard with the eraser end of one of the pencils. His first search resulted in nothing, but it was a strange sort of nothing. Usually finding nothing on the internet means finding several things that aren't what you're looking for. In this case, the results said, "Your search, Lafayette Cordonnier, did not match any documents." Vogel expected this, having performed the ritual many times before. Most wealthy people had enough resources to keep their names out of the news and to exert some measure of control over the details of their private lives. In this regard, Lafayette Cordonnier was in a class by himself. He had the resources required to keep his name out of even internet searches. Vogel tried again with the word luck, but found only the usual nonsense and advertisements for gambling. He searched for unlucky with similar results. Vogel sighed and tried to think. His formerly brilliant mind was now so damaged that it took a real effort to concentrate on anything. He closed his eyes. What did fate call it? He opened his eyes and tapped in the lines, but found nothing unusual. He tried tangled lines and finally saw the link labeled "Restrict Search to Local Items." Perfect, he thought, and reached for the mouse. The computer's monitor, which had been flickering since he sat down, went completely black. He cursed and moved to the vacated neighboring cubicle. A repeat of the same search brought him to the same dilemma: how to click a link without touching the mouse. The pencils worked well enough on the keyboard, but the mouse was a different matter. No amount of prodding with pencils would make it go where he needed. He remembered his gloves and put them on. Previous tests using only his gloves to type on keyboards had failed, but the mouse might be different. In one swift move, he navigated to the link, clicked, and pulled his hand away. The search results changed to display only local items. Daniel's blog article appeared as the first result. He read it with growing interest. A few more searches, and Vogel had Daniel's home address and the school's bus route. "Excuse me, sir," a voice behind him said. Vogel turned around to see a thin man in a sweater vest holding a clipboard to his chest. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He placed a white handkerchief over his nose and mouth before taking a breath. "Some of the other patrons have complained." I hate to be rude, but your odor is offensive." Vogel stood and looked around the room. Everyone else had left. Even the other staff had retreated to the parking lot. "I don't see any patrons," he growled. "Still, I must insist." Vogel pulled off his glove and grasped the man's face with his bare hand. The clipboard dropped to the floor quickly, followed by the unconscious librarian. Vogel returned to his computer and searched for one more thing before standing to leave. He stepped over the librarian and headed for the door. The patrons had all left, but outside the front door, the other 3 staff members were waiting for the air to clear before returning to work. Vogel approached them. He was quick enough to touch each of them with his ungloved hand. They collapsed in a heap. With no one else in sight, he proceeded to his buggy. His grey mare, Brienne, flinched as he passed. As soon as he was aboard, he viciously whipped the poor horse into the street. This was the only mode of travel left to him since his unusual accident. Every car he had touched since then had developed a sudden and serious mechanical failure. Unlike machines and humans, Brienne seemed unaffected by Vogel's affliction. "Which way?" he muttered to himself and pulled a pair of small, flat metal shapes from his pocket. They were each the size of a quarter, blue and shaped like dog bones. A 6-inch piece of fishing line held them together. On the faces, where one would expect a pet's name and a phone number, he had scribbled crude black instructions: turn right, turn left, stop, and go straight. He tossed them into the air. They tumbled end over end, the swivels at each tag ensuring their independent motion. He snatched one in midair and opened his palm. It said, "Straight." Knowing he should do the opposite and turn, he tossed them again. This time, the chosen tag said, "Turn left." Vogel pulled the reins hard for a right turn. Repeating this at each corner and always taking the opposite advice, he eventually arrived at a dead-end street. He slowed to examine the houses on each side. Every yard on the street had 2 things in common: dead grass and a for sale sign. The last house at the end was an old Victorian that had been white at some point in the distant past. The windows were covered with plywood already grayed with age. The remnants of a funeral home sign leaned against the front porch. He didn't need to consult his dog tags. This was obviously his destination. He stowed them back in their pocket and steered his horse onto the gravel driveway. At the rear of the house, he let her wander onto the tall grass before stopping. She hungrily pulled at the greener parts while he climbed down to examine his latest temporary housing. There were 2 ways in from the backyard: a kitchen door and an old pair of side-by-side wooden cellar doors leaning at an angle over wide cement steps. Assuming the house to be empty, he simply broke the glass on the kitchen door and strolled inside. There was no electricity, and with the windows covered by plywood, the darkness was complete. He grunted and trudged back outside. Brienne had pulled the buggy to the hedge at the rear of the property to graze on the remnants of an herb garden. He scanned the rear facade of the house and found the electric meter. The power company had locked it long ago. He touched the cold glass with his ungloved hand. It cracked loudly, and the plastic lock fell away. He pulled the meter off and tossed it to the ground. The glass shattered on contact with the narrow sidewalk that ran the length of the house. 2 of the 4 loose wires were coming down from the overhead cable, and the other 2 disappeared into the house. He returned the glove to his hand and twisted each wire to its matching counterpart, bypassing the removed meter. The porch light immediately flickered to life. Vogel returned to the kitchen. He wasn't surprised to find that there was nothing useful there and proceeded to search the rest of the house. The upstairs bedrooms had peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. The bathrooms also proved useless, having no running water and a stronger odor of something foul. Vogel was nothing if not thorough, and even checked the attic. Aside from an old trunk with a broken hinge, it was as empty as the rest of the house. He tromped down the creaky stairs and came once again to the kitchen. The cellar door stared defiantly back at him as he examined it. Not many things bothered Shadrach Vogel. Even before his accident, he had only one phobia: basements. He usually avoided them, but in this case, he couldn't risk it. If he was going to use this house, he had to be sure he was alone. He sighed and opened the door. It creaked on rusty hinges, adding to the sinister atmosphere. The one light from the kitchen didn't penetrate far down the narrow stairway. Whatever waited for him at the bottom was swaddled in complete darkness. He gritted his teeth, let out a low growl, and cautiously took the first step. At the bottom of the stairs, Vogel realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to breathe. The space smelled of dirt, moisture, and a faint chemical odor he couldn't identify. Vogel slid his hands along the wall, searching for a switch. Finding none, he changed tactics and waved his hands in the open air of what he could only guess was a large room. The string attached to the overhead light was too light to feel as Vogel brushed it with his gloved hand. The short metal chain to which the string was tied clinked against the bare glass light bulb. He grasped the cord and gave it a pull. The light responded with a click and a warm glow. Vogel drew another long breath and let it out slowly. It wasn't a large room as expected, but instead a hallway that ran down the center of the house. It turned to the right at the far end, where a wide set of stairs led upward. He checked that first and verified that they were the same ones he saw in the backyard. Vogel turned his attention back to the long hallway. It had only two doors, one on each side. He ventured closer and noticed the locks below the doorknobs. As his eyes fell on the keys hanging on a hook beside one of the doors, Vogel did something he hadn't done in over a month. He smiled. The two rooms adjoining the hallway were also empty except for a large pile of junk, consisting mostly of broken appliances. The home's last occupant, whoever that was, had made a thorough job of emptying the entire house. Vogel cautiously removed the doorknobs and reversed them so that he could lock people in rather than out. As he was about to begin unloading the heavy cargo from his buggy, the doorbell rang. The sound seemed so out of place that Vogel flinched at the noise. Before he was halfway up the kitchen stairs, it rang again. He reached the front door and opened it to find a young couple in their mid-20s. They were both smiling brightly. The woman was holding a tin square covered with cellophane wrapping. She thrust it forward, offering it to Vogel, who seemed unsure what to do with it. "Welcome to the neighborhood," they said in unison. "We're the Coles from next door," the husband began, and pointed to the closest house. "We only just moved in this week, but we're sure glad to see someone coming to fix up this great old house." He thrust out his hand. "Bob Cole." Vogel looked down at the proffered hand with curiosity. "Shadrach Vogel," he said almost under his breath, and shook the man's hand, keeping his gloves on. "Oh, I have the exact same kind of gloves," said Bob enthusiastically. "We're doing some remodeling ourselves," his wife said, and giggled. "This is my wife Muriel," said Bob. She offered her own hand. "Remodeling, huh?" Vogel purred. He momentarily considered just killing them and dragging them inside. But then he thought of the heavy load in his buggy and carrying it all down to the basement himself. He shook her hand gently. "I wonder if I could impose on you to help me unload some things from my buggy. It won't take long, and they're not very heavy. Just awkward, you see. Of course, we'd love to help. We're just so tickled pink that we're getting a new neighbor," said Bob. Vogel led them through the house to the backyard, where Brienne was still grazing. Without unhitching her, he simply set the brake so she couldn't wander around. In the rear of the buggy, he pulled back a blue plastic tarp to reveal a dozen rusty sheets of metal. They were each 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, with raised edges in which holes had been drilled. It looked like what it was, parts for a huge steel box bearing more than a passing resemblance to a medieval jail cell. Vogel caught their surprised expressions. "I'm an artist, and these are raw material for my work," he lied. They both relaxed and nodded. "Of course. You're an artist," Bob said, and gestured to the horse while looking at his wife. "That explains the interesting way you get around." "Yes," said Vogel, pleased with himself. "Oh, and don't worry, though. These pieces look heavy, but they really aren't." He lifted the corner of the top panel with 2 fingers and dropped it back down. Bob helped Vogel carry the first piece down to one of the rooms in the basement. Vogel feigned a back cramp and sat down to massage it. Right on cue, Muriel lent a hand, and the couple moved the remainder of the panels into Vogel's basement. "I hate to ask, since you've both been so helpful," said Vogel. The couple glanced at each other without smiling. They were still out of breath from the exertion of moving the metal panels. "But I wonder if I might borrow a wrench." They seemed relieved that it wasn't more manual labor and slipped back into their smiles. "Of course! Come on over. We'll give you the nickel tour." Vogel followed them to their house and killed them both, leaving their bodies on the floor of the garage. The next morning, Vogel steered Brienne through the 8 a.m. traffic, getting honks from several angry drivers. Arriving at his destination, he found no available parking spaces large enough for a horse and buggy, so he rounded the corner and pulled into the narrow alley. He counted the unmarked gray steel doors until he found the one he was looking for. Brienne stopped and waited patiently as Vogel hopped down to see if the shop's rear door was locked. He jiggled the knob. No luck. He removed his glove and tried again. The doorknob clicked and turned, but came off in his hand as the door swung open. The inside half of the knob, now free of its bonds, dropped to the concrete floor with a loud clatter. Madison and Ryan turned to the intruder who had just strolled through their locked alley door. They had been in mid-conversation about the monopole devices and how best to utilize the amazing new technology. Ryan rotated on his workbench stool and stood to face Vogel. "Can I help you?" "Oh yes, I'm sure you can. You see, I'm looking for a boy. His name is Daniel Shires. Is he here?" "Who the hell are you? And what do you want with my brother?" demanded Madison. "Sister," Vogel thought, and stepped closer. As soon as he was within reach, Vogel touched each of them with his ungloved hand. Their limp bodies fell to the floor. Vogel looked at Madison's unconscious body. "You might be useful," he thought, as he slipped his gloves back on and lifted her onto his shoulder.